The medieval world was a time of great change, a time when kingdoms rose and fell, empires expanded, and the global economy was shaped by the humble crops that fed millions of people across continents. But of all the crops that sustained the medieval world, one stood above the rest in value, not just as a food source, but as a driver of power, wealth, and influence. And no, it's not wheat or barley. It's something far more valuable, something that shaped societies, economies, and even wars. Imagine a world where this crop is so prized that it becomes the foundation of empires, the center of trade routes, and the fuel for entire industries. The medieval world was a world where your survival could depend on it and your status could be elevated by it. Intrigued? Well, you're about to uncover the secret that made this crop the most valuable in the medieval world. Let's rewind a bit to the early medieval period, a time when the world was recovering from the chaos of the fall of the Roman Empire. Europe, much of Asia, and parts of North Africa were rebuilding from the ground up, and agricultural innovation was crucial for survival. People were desperate for reliable crops that could be grown consistently to feed populations that were expanding. Now, you might think of wheat as the go-to crop. After all, bread was a staple food, and grains like wheat and barley were essential to diets across Europe. But there was one crop that surpassed all others in its economic value: the wool from sheep. Yes, wool, the soft, warm, and incredibly versatile material that, in many ways, drove the medieval economy. Wool was the backbone of medieval trade, and here's why. In a time when there were no factories, no machines, and very little mechanization, wool became a key material in textile production. Think about it. People needed clothing, they needed bedding, they needed tapestries, and most importantly, they needed warm garments to survive the harsh winters. Wool was the perfect solution. It was cheap to produce, durable, and could be spun and woven into a variety of goods that were in high demand. In medieval Europe, especially in places like England and the Low Countries, wool wasn't just a material, it was a currency. For centuries, it was the backbone of the English economy. King Edward I of England even imposed taxes on wool exports, showing just how important it was. In fact, wool was so valuable that the production and export of wool became a major driving force in the rise of medieval towns and cities, as well as in the expansion of trade across Europe. But let's take a deeper look at the importance of wool beyond just clothing. Why did it dominate the medieval world in the way it did? It all comes down to trade. Wool was traded across vast distances, from the sheep farms of England to the bustling markets of Italy, the textile workshops in Flanders, and even as far as the Middle East. Wool was spun into yarn, dyed, and woven into fabrics of all types, from simple cloth to the finest woolen garments worn by the rich and powerful. There was even a special kind of wool known as broadcloth, a high-quality, thick wool fabric that was exported throughout Europe and beyond. The Italian city-states were the heart of this wool trade. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa became immensely wealthy through the production of woolen goods. Florence, for example, was home to a powerful wool guild called the Arte della Lana, which controlled the wool trade in the city and helped to elevate Florence to become one of the wealthiest cities in Europe by the 14th century. This wool trade wasn't just about commerce, though. It was about power. Towns and regions that controlled the wool trade controlled vast amounts of wealth. Merchants became more powerful than kings, and city-states that produced woolen goods had economic clout on a scale that rivaled entire nations. And let's not forget the importance of wool in the creation of wealth and status. The richest families of the medieval world, especially in places like England and Italy, built their fortunes on wool, and in a time when wealth was often determined by land and property, wool allowed these families to flourish. It was the medieval equivalent of investing in gold or oil, except it was renewable and it could be used to create products that were in demand all over the world. As the demand for wool grew, so did the power of the wool-producing regions. In fact, wool was so valuable that it played a central role in shaping medieval politics and conflicts. In the early 14th century, England found itself embroiled in a series of wars with France, known as the 100 Years' War. But one of the lesser-known causes of this conflict was the competition for control over the wool trade. English wool was in high demand in France, and French producers were eager to get their hands on the high-quality wool produced in England. This rivalry over wool was one of the driving forces behind the war, as both nations fought not only for land, but for access to the lucrative wool markets. Wool was so important that it even found its way into the hearts and minds of medieval kings and queens. King Henry IV of England, for example, passed a law that allowed wool to be exported only under strict regulations, ensuring that England would maintain its monopoly on high-quality wool. This regulation caused a great deal of tension with neighboring nations, especially those who relied on English wool to fuel their textile industries. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. Wool wasn't just valuable because it could be spun into fabric. It also had deep symbolic meaning in medieval society. A person's wealth and status were often reflected by the quality and quantity of wool they could afford. Fine woolen garments indicated a person's noble status, while coarse wool clothing was associated with the lower classes. A nobleman's cloak, woven from the finest wool, could be seen as a symbol of his power and prestige. Wool was, in many ways, a social equalizer. The quality of wool you wore determined where you stood in the social hierarchy. So we've established that wool was the medieval equivalent of liquid gold. But what happened to this highly valuable crop as time went on? Well, by the late medieval period, the wool trade began to face challenges. As wool became more valuable, the demand for it grew, but so did the competition. Other regions, such as Spain, began producing their own high-quality wool, and the Italian city-states, once the epicenter of wool production, began facing economic difficulties. The invention of the spinning wheel in the late medieval period also contributed to the decline of the wool trade's dominance, as it made fabric production much faster and more efficient. In addition, the rise of other industries, such as silk production and the growing use of cotton, started to eat away at wool's supremacy. As global trade networks expanded, new materials from distant parts of the world began to enter European markets. But despite these challenges, wool remained a valuable commodity well into the Renaissance period, though its grip on the economy loosened over time. Now you may be wondering, with all this talk about wool, what happened to other crops like wheat, barley, and grain? Well, while these crops were certainly crucial for feeding the population, they didn't hold the same kind of economic and social influence as wool. Wheat and barley were essential to survival, but they didn't drive the medieval economy in the same way that wool did. Crops like wheat could be traded, but they didn't hold the same kind of status or value that wool did as a luxury product and a symbol of wealth. So, next time you hear about the medieval world, remember this: the most valuable crop wasn't just something that fed people. It wasn't just something that grew in fields and was harvested every year. It was the humble wool which wove its way into the fabric of medieval society, shaping the economy, politics, and even the very nature of medieval life. Wool was the thread that tied the medieval world together, and without it, the tapestry of the medieval economy would have been far less colorful, far less rich, and far less enduring.